Stand on the eastern shore of Bali and look across the water. That island on the horizon is Lombok, only about 20 miles away, close enough that on a clear day it doesn't feel like another world. It feels like the next chapter of the same one. The waves are calm. Fishing boats move through the strait. The air is warm and heavy, the kind of tropical air that makes everything seem connected, sea to sky, island to island, forest to forest. And if you didn't know better, you might think life should move through this place just as easily as the boats do. Birds could fly across. Seeds could drift. Animals, given enough time, might island hop their way from one shore to the other. There is no wall here. No mountain range. No desert. No sheet of ice. Nothing you can point to and say, there, that is where one world ends and another begins. But for countless living things, this narrow stretch of ocean has behaved like a locked door. On one side of it, the natural world feels deeply Asian, shaped by animals and lineages that seem connected to the great forests and plains of the West. On the other side, the cast begins to change, almost as if nature quietly swapped out the actors while no one was watching. And that is where this scene stops being a postcard and starts becoming a mystery. Because somewhere in that ordinary-looking water is one of the strangest boundaries in the history of life on Earth, a barrier you cannot see, but whose fingerprints show up in feathers, fur, scales, bones, and absences. Especially absences. The strange thing about this line is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rise above the waves like a reef. It doesn't carve the sky like a mountain chain. It is not the kind of boundary humans are good at noticing. We like borders that look like borders. Rivers. Cliffs. Fences. Coastlines. Things with edges. But this one is different. It has to be detected indirectly, by watching where life changes its mind. A kind of biological silence falls across the strait. Species that are common on one side fail to appear on the other. Entire groups that seem like they should keep going simply stop. And other creatures, more familiar from the direction of Australia, begin to take their place. Which is rude, honestly. If you're going to divide the living world in half, the least you could do is put up a sign. But nature rarely does that. Instead, it leaves clues. A bird that should be present, but isn't. A mammal group that reaches one island and goes no farther. A set of animals that makes two nearby places feel as if they were assembled from different evolutionary toolkits. And the more closely scientists looked, the more this region began to feel less like a smooth transition and more like a crime scene. Not a crime with a victim in the usual sense, but a mystery with a missing connection. Why should two islands, separated by such a modest gap of water, carry such different histories of life? Why should crossing a strait that looks so ordinary feel, biologically, like crossing between continents? And why does this invisible barrier seem to matter more than distance itself? Because that may be the most unsettling part. Bali and Lombok are close. Much closer than many places that share more similar animals. So the easy explanation, that life is different simply because places are far apart, starts to fall apart almost immediately. The map you can see with your eyes is not enough. The coastline, the blue water, the short distance between shores, all of that is only the surface of the case. Somewhere beneath it is another map, older and stranger, drawn not in roads or borders, but in sea depth, vanished land bridges, moving continents, and chances that life either had or never got. And this is the first clue: the barrier is invisible only if you are looking in the wrong way. Look at the water, and nothing seems unusual. Look at the animals, and a line begins to appear. Look deeper still, and that line starts to look less like a boundary between islands and more like a scar left by deep time. The question is not just what this invisible barrier is. The real question is how something you cannot see can divide two worlds so completely, and how many millions of years had to pass before life on either side became different enough to reveal it. Now shift your eyes from that strip of water to the living things on either side, because this is where the mystery gets harder to wave away. On Bali, the forests belong to a world that feels connected to mainland Asia. It is a world of monkeys moving through the canopy, of deer stepping through humid undergrowth, of birds whose relatives spread across Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and beyond. Even when the species are local, the flavor of the ecosystem feels familiar, like a tropical extension of a much larger western continent. The trees drip with moisture. Insects buzz in the heat. Birds call from the forest edge. Everything seems to fit into a pattern that stretches back towards Southeast Asia. But then, cross that narrow stretch of sea toward Lombok, and the pattern begins to slip. Not all at once, and not in a way that would be obvious if you were just wandering through the forest with a camera and a sunburn, but in the deeper inventory of life, the change is real. Certain animals that should feel at home here simply are not there. Some groups fade out. Others begin to appear, pointing eastward, toward islands and continents with a very different evolutionary history. It is not like walking from one neighborhood into another. It is more like opening the same book and realizing that someone has changed the language halfway through the chapter. And this is what makes the boundary so strange. Islands are supposed to be weird, of course. That is kind of their thing. Put life on a patch of land surrounded by ocean, give it enough time, and evolution starts experimenting like it has been left alone in the garage with power tools. Birds get bigger or smaller. Mammals vanish or shrink. Reptiles take jobs you did not expect reptiles to take. So, some difference between Bali and Lombok would not be shocking. The shocking part is how sharply the pattern turns, and how that turn shows up again and again across the region. It is not just one unlucky animal failing to make the crossing. It is a whole suite of living things behaving as if this short gap is much wider than it looks. Think about that for a second. 20 miles of ocean is not nothing, especially if you are a small mammal that is not especially enthusiastic about open water. Fair. But birds have wings. Seeds can raft on storm debris. Reptiles have crossed oceans before under circumstances that sound completely unreasonable, until you remember that nature has no respect for our expectations. Given enough time, rare events add up. A floating tree here, a storm-blown bird there, a pregnant animal on a natural raft at exactly the wrong moment for its personal comfort, and exactly the right moment for biogeography. Over thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years, chance can become history. So why does this place still look so divided? That question gets even stranger when you zoom out. Bali and Lombok are not alone. They sit inside the Malay archipelago, a sprawling maze of islands scattered between Asia and Australia, where land and sea seem to break into fragments. From above, it looks like the Earth spilled a box of puzzle pieces into the tropics. Some islands are large enough to carry forests, mountains, rivers, and whole communities of animals. Others are small enough to feel like stepping stones. And if life could simply hop from one to the next, you might expect the animals to blur gradually across the chain, like colors blending in wet paint. But that is not what scientists found. Instead, the region behaves more like a hidden filter. Some lineages pass through. Others stop. Some eastern creatures push west only so far. Some western creatures push east only so far. The result is not a clean wall, exactly, but it is also not random. It is a pattern with teeth. And the more you look at it, the more the visible landscape feels like a distraction. The beaches, the forests, the blue channels between islands, all of that seems to be telling one story. These places are close, warm, and connected by sea. But the animals are telling another story. Something here has kept histories apart for a very long time. Which means the first assumption has to break. Maybe the most important distance in this place is not the distance across the water. Maybe it is the distance through time. Because if two islands can sit close enough to see each other, and still carry the marks of different worlds, then the real barrier may not be measured in miles at all. It may be measured in lost land bridges, ancient seas, and opportunities that evolution never got. So what was this ordinary-looking ocean hiding, and why did life seem to know about it long before humans drew it on a map? Put the two worlds side by side, and the strangeness finally starts to take shape. On the western side, the animal life belongs to a familiar Asian story. Imagine forests where monkeys move through branches with the confidence of creatures whose relatives have spread across a connected mainland. Picture deer picking through the understory, civets slipping through the dark, woodpeckers hammering into trunks, and mammals that make sense if you think of these islands as the ragged tropical edge of Asia. Even the absences have a kind of logic there. The place feels like a broken-off piece of a larger world, as if the forests of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Asian mainland once shared more than just climate. They shared routes. They shared ancestry. They shared chances for life to move. But then, just across the water, the cast begins to change in a way that is hard to unsee. Move eastward, and the world starts picking up characters from a different evolutionary script, cockatoos instead of some of the birds you might expect from the west, honeyeaters where other familiar groups fade, and farther along the island chain, marsupials and animals whose deepest connections point toward Australia and New Guinea. It is not that every creature flips instantly, as if someone changed the channel. Nature is messier than that, and honestly, much less considerate to anyone trying to make a neat map. But the overall pattern is sharp enough to make you stop. The same sun beats down. The same warm seas surround the islands. The same kind of tropical green seems to cover the hills. Yet the living inventory begins to feel like two shelves in the same museum, curated by different histories. This was the first real clue, not a fossil tooth pulled from stone, not a skull half buried in desert rock, but distribution itself. Where animals are found. Where they are not found. Where one group reaches its edge, and another begins. In this story, the map becomes the fossil. The species lists become the bones. The missing animals become the empty spaces in the skeleton. And those empty spaces matter. Because if you only look at what is present, you might think you are seeing ordinary island weirdness. A bird here, a lizard there, some mammals that made it and others that did not. Fine. Islands do that. But if you look at what should have been able to arrive, and somehow did not, the pattern becomes more suspicious. Why would so many Western animals reach the islands on one side and then fail to cross a short stretch of sea? Why would Eastern animals press westward, but also seem to run into their own invisible limit? Why does the whole region feel less like a gradual blend and more like two crowds meeting at a doorway that only some can squeeze through? And the doorway is important, because this was never just about Bali and Lombok. That narrow crossing is the easiest place to picture the mystery, but the pattern stretches through a much larger maze of islands. North and south, across the Malay archipelago, scientists found that the change in animal life followed a strange, uneven path. It curved through seas and islands like a line drawn by someone who cared less about modern geography and more about ancient memory. On one side were animals with ties to Asia. On the other were animals with ties to Australia. Between them was not a simple border, but a zone of tension, a place where histories approached each other without fully merging. Which raises a problem. If this is just about ocean distance, the pattern should be simpler. Wider channels should be harder to cross. Narrower channels should be easier. Islands closer together should be more alike. Islands farther apart should be more different. That is the common sense version, and common sense does love walking into deep time and embarrassing itself. Because here, the visible distances do not line up neatly with the biological distances. Some islands that look close on a map sit on opposite sides of a huge evolutionary divide. Others that seem more separated share more of the same biological heritage. The clue was not just that two worlds existed. It was that their border refused to obey the map people could see. So now the mystery has a shape. There are animals on one side that seem to belong to Asia. There are animals on the other that seem to belong to Australia. There is a region where the transition is too sharp to ignore, but too irregular to be a simple wall. And the evidence is not lying in a single dramatic fossil bed. It is scattered through forests, coastlines, bird calls, mammal ranges, and the quiet absence of creatures that never crossed. Something had arranged these islands into two neighboring worlds. But whatever did it was not obvious from the surface. And if the first evidence came from life itself, then the next question becomes even stranger. What kind of boundary can be discovered by animals, ignored by human eyes, and hidden almost completely beneath the sea? The first hard clue came from people who were doing something deceptively simple: making lists. Not dramatic, I know. No thunderstorm, no giant skeleton emerging from a cliff face, no scientist whispering, "My God!" while brushing sand off a skull. Just naturalists moving from island to island, writing down what they saw. A bird here. A beetle there. A mammal present on one island but missing from the next. But in a place like the Malay archipelago, a list can become a map, and a map can become a confession. Because when those observations were stacked together, a strange pattern appeared. Some animals common across the western islands simply dropped out before reaching the east. Woodpeckers, for example, are widespread across much of Asia and the western side of the island world. They are not weak flyers in the way a brick is a weak flyer. They are birds. They have options. And yet, moving east, their presence begins to thin and then vanish in places where, at first glance, you might expect them to continue. That absence is not just trivia. It is a footprint made by something that is not there. But then, on the other side, different birds begin to tell a different story. Cockatoos and honeyeaters, groups much more associated with Australia and the islands around it, become part of the eastern cast. They are not just decorative background characters. They are clues with feathers. Their presence suggests that the eastern islands were drawing from a different source of life, a different evolutionary neighborhood. So now the mystery has two halves: western animals that seem to stop, and eastern animals that seem to begin. Which raises a question: if the islands are all part of the same tropical maze, why are the animals not blending together more smoothly? The answer was not obvious, especially in the 19th century, when Alfred Russel Wallace moved through this region collecting specimens and noticing the pattern. Picture the work as less like sitting in a modern lab and more like solving a puzzle while traveling through heat, rain, insects, disease, and a lot of boats that probably would not pass anyone's current safety standards. Wallace was not looking down from satellites. He did not have DNA databases or plate tectonic reconstructions on a laptop. He had bodies, skins, wings, labels, notes, where each creature was found, and just as importantly, where it was not. And as he crossed from island to island, the same odd message kept coming through. The change in life was not gradual enough to match the short distances involved. It was abrupt. Bali and Lombok made this especially unsettling. Two islands close enough to see across the water, but with animal communities that pointed in different directions. On the western side, many lineages looked back toward Asia. On the eastern side, life began leaning toward Australia. It was as if the islands were neighbors in space, but strangers in ancestry. But that was only the first clue, and it created a new problem. Because animals do not care about human maps. They do not stop at borders because someone drew a line with ink. If a bird can fly, if a seed can float, if a storm can carry a living thing somewhere ridiculous, then over enough time, life has a way of making a mess of neat boundaries. So why did this boundary hold well enough to be visible in the distribution of entire groups? Maybe the barrier was not absolute. That is important. This was never a magic force field. Some creatures did cross. Some lineages did blur the pattern. The living world is not a spreadsheet, and evolution has a strong commitment to making exceptions. But the exceptions made the pattern more interesting, not less. Because if some organisms crossed while many others did not, then the barrier was acting less like a wall and more like a filter. It did not stop everything. It selected. It allowed some kinds of travelers through and blocked others again and again across deep time. And that turns the mystery into something sharper. A wall is easy to imagine. A filter is harder. A filter means the barrier had rules. Not human rules, but biological ones. Who can fly far enough, who can survive salt water, who can raft across open sea, who needs continuous forest, who can handle isolation once they arrive. But those rules still needed a physical source. Something in the landscape, or under the landscape, had to be setting the terms. The visible world offered only a short stretch of water. The animals were implying something much older and more powerful. So the first evidence did not answer the case. It deepened it. The species lists revealed a line. The missing animals gave the line weight. The eastern and western communities showed that two histories were pressing against each other. But the biggest clue was still hidden from view. If the boundary was real enough for animals to obey, but invisible enough for humans to miss, then maybe the next place to look was not across the water at all. Maybe it was down. So the suspects began to line up. If animals were stopping in some places and passing through others, something had to be shaping the rules of movement. The first suspect was simple distance. Maybe the channels were just too wide, too rough, too punishing for most animals to cross. That sounds reasonable until you look more closely and realize distance is a very unreliable witness. Some islands separated by wider stretches of water share more biological similarities than islands divided by narrower ones. Some creatures seem to have crossed impressive gaps elsewhere, while others fail at crossings that look almost embarrassingly small on a map. Distance was involved, sure, but it was not acting alone. It was the kind of suspect that definitely knew something, but probably did not commit the whole crime. Then came the second suspect, climate. Maybe one side was wetter, drier, hotter, cooler, or covered in a different kind of forest. And in many parts of the world, that would be a strong explanation. Animals are picky. Plants are picky. Whole ecosystems can shift when rainfall patterns change or when mountains squeeze clouds out of the air. But here, the climate did not draw a clean enough line. Across these tropical islands there were differences, of course, because there are always differences. But nothing obvious on the surface explained why so many lineages would treat one narrow region as a major turning point. The forests did not suddenly become the surface of Mars. The air did not turn to ice. The ocean did not become a boiling moat filled with dramatic theme music. So climate stayed on the board, but it did not solve the case either. Another suspect was chance. Island life is full of chance. A storm blows a bird off course. A mat of vegetation tears loose from a riverbank and carries small animals out to sea. A few survivors land somewhere new, and suddenly evolution has a new project. Over long stretches of time, these accidents can build entire communities. But chance has a problem. When you see the same kind of pattern repeating across many groups of animals, over many islands, chance starts looking less like an explanation and more like background noise. Random events happen, but this did not look purely random. It looked structured. It looked as if some hidden feature was shaping which accidents could become history. And that is when the case starts to move away from the islands themselves. Because the islands are not just dots of land surrounded by water. They are the visible tips of a much larger landscape, most of which is drowned. Under the waves are shelves, slopes, basins, ridges, and trenches. Some seas are shallow enough that, when the planet locks water away in ice and sea level falls, they can turn into dry land. Others are so deep that even a major drop in sea level leaves them filled with water. And that difference changes everything. Imagine the ocean pulling back during an ice age. Across shallow seas, land appears like a stage being revealed after the curtain rises. Islands that once seemed separate become connected. Forests spread. Rivers cut across new plains. Animals do not need rafts or miraculous storms anymore. They can walk. For species on the western side, this mattered enormously, because many of those islands sat on shallow continental shelf connected to Asia during times of low sea level. In those moments, the boundary between mainland and island blurred. What looks today like a scattered archipelago could become, for many animals, a connected extension of the continent. But here comes the twist: not every channel disappeared. Some stretches of water were too deep. Even when sea level dropped, they remained open, dark, and separating. They were not just gaps between islands. They were old cuts in the earth, deep enough to resist the changing climate above them. So the real barrier was not the blue surface people saw from a beach or a boat. It was the shape of the seafloor underneath. Which is a little unfair, because the seafloor is not exactly volunteering that information to anyone standing in the sun with binoculars. But the animals had been responding to it all along. This made the mystery more complicated than a simple line on a map. The boundary was not a perfect wall, and it was not created by one single factor. It was a filter built from distance, biology, chance, ocean currents, island size, and most importantly, ancient geography hidden below sea level. That is the mini twist. The invisible barrier was not invisible because it was imaginary. It was invisible because most of it was underwater, and most of its history happened when the map looked nothing like it does today. But even this does not close the case. Because once you realize that drowned landscapes can decide where life goes, a bigger question appears. Who decided the shape of those drowned landscapes in the first place? Why were some seas shallow bridges, while others stayed deep, permanent moats? To answer that, the investigation has to go deeper than sea level, deeper than islands, and into the slow machinery that moves continents. Once the seafloor enters the story, the clues start snapping together in a way that makes the whole archipelago feel less like a scattering of islands and more like a half-submerged machine. Start with the shallow seas to the west. Today, places like Sumatra, Java, Bali, and Borneo look separated by water, like beads spilled across the edge of Southeast Asia. But lower the sea level during an ice age, and much of that water drains off the map. The islands do not look so isolated anymore. They become part of a larger exposed shelf, a broad tropical extension of Asia where animals could spread across land that is now hidden beneath the ocean. That explains why so many Western islands carry an Asian biological signature. They were not always islands in the way they are now. But then that raises the next question. If falling seas could stitch so much of the West together, why did the pattern not continue eastward? Why did the same planetary trick not simply keep revealing more bridges? The answer begins with depth. Move east of Bali, and the seafloor changes character. The channels become deeper, steeper, harder to erase. Even when glaciers locked up enormous amounts of water and coastlines marched outward, some of these passages stayed wet. They did not become highways. They stayed moats. So now the animal pattern begins to make sense from a new angle. The Western species were not just lucky. They had land, or at least more land, more often. Their world expanded and contracted with the ice ages, like a breathing continent. But the deeper channels held the line, keeping many animals from simply walking into the islands beyond. Which solves part of the mystery, but immediately creates another one. Why is the seafloor shaped that way in the first place? Because sea level can reveal or hide land, but it does not invent the bones of the planet. It only exposes them. To understand the deep channels, you have to look at the architecture underneath the archipelago. And that architecture was built by moving plates, colliding fragments, sinking crust, volcanic arcs, and millions of years of geological restlessness. This part of the world is not a calm edge of the map. It is a tectonic traffic jam. Pieces of Asia, Australia, and island arcs have been pushing, sliding, rotating, and crashing together for ages, and the result is a region where neighboring islands can have very different geological roots. Some sit on shallow continental shelf. Others rise from deep water. Some have been connected to large landmasses again and again. Others have spent much more of their history isolated, surrounded by channels that never became easy crossings. And now the biological evidence looks different. Those missing animals are not just failures of migration. They are signs of ancient geography doing crowd control. The birds, mammals, reptiles, and insects were responding to a landscape humans could not see, a landscape that only appears if you rewind the ocean and watch the crust move. But that leads to another question. If the barrier was so powerful, why is the division not perfectly clean? Why do some creatures cross, while others do not? This is where the story becomes more interesting than a simple wall. A deep channel does not affect every organism the same way. A large mammal that needs continuous forest has a very different relationship with open ocean than a bird blown off course by a storm. A freshwater animal faces a different problem than a salt-tolerant reptile. A plant with seeds that can float has different odds than one whose seeds drop politely to the forest floor and go nowhere, which is not exactly an adventurous strategy. So the boundary works like a filter, and filters produce messy patterns. They block some things strongly. They let others through occasionally. And when those rare crossings happen, evolution can take over on the far side, making exceptions that complicate the map without destroying the larger pattern. So now we can return to the original scene with better eyes. That narrow crossing between islands is not just water. It is the visible surface of a hidden history. At different times, ice ages opened land routes across the west. Deep channels kept other routes closed. Tectonic forces built the shelves and basins that decided where those routes could exist in the first place. And living things, with all their different bodies, behaviors, and limits, responded in different ways. The result is a boundary that is real, but uneven, powerful, but permeable, invisible, but written across the distribution of life. And yet one piece is still missing. Because even if geology built the stage and sea level raised and lowered the curtain, the story is not only about where animals could go. It is also about how long they were kept apart. A barrier that lasts for a few storm seasons is an inconvenience. A barrier that lasts through ice ages, extinctions, migrations, and millions of years becomes something else entirely. It becomes an engine of separate histories. So the next clue is not just the shape of the seafloor. It is time. Time is the part of this mystery that turns a barrier into a history. A short-lived obstacle can change a migration. A long-lived obstacle can change the world on either side of it. And this is where the story twists. Because the narrow water between islands was never the full explanation. It was only the most visible clue. The real force was not just that animals had trouble crossing a channel. It was that the channel, and others like it, kept mattering again and again while the planet changed around them. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels fell and rose. Coastlines moved outward then drowned again. Forests expanded, fragmented, and returned. But some deep passages stayed open, cutting through the region like old wounds that refused to heal. So the boundary we see in living animals today is not just a present-day border. It is a memory. It is the biological shadow of ancient seafloors, vanished coastlines, and tectonic decisions made long before humans were around to be confused by them. That is the big reversal. The line does not exist because two modern islands happen to be separated by water. The modern islands look separated because they are the last visible pieces of a much older geography. The animals are not responding only to today's map. They are carrying the consequences of maps that no longer exist. Think about the Western Islands again. During cold periods, when so much seawater was locked away in ice, the shallow Sunda Shelf could emerge as land. Forests and grasslands could spread across areas that are now submerged. Animals did not need to be heroic ocean voyagers. Many could simply move. To them, parts of the island world may have felt less like an archipelago, and more like a broad, shifting peninsula of Asia. And then, when the climate warmed, the water came back. The land bridges drowned. The animals that had already spread were stranded on islands. What looks today like a series of separate places is partly the flooded remains of former connections. But eastward, where the seafloor dropped into deeper channels, that trick did not work the same way. Even when the sea retreated, the deepest cuts stayed wet. These were not temporary puddles between future land bridges. They were durable separations. And durable separations are exactly the kind evolution notices. Not consciously, obviously. Evolution is not sitting there with a clipboard saying, "Interesting channel, let us produce marsupials." But over thousands and then millions of years, barriers sort possibilities. A lineage that can cross gets a new chance. A lineage that cannot remains behind. A population isolated long enough begins to drift, adapt, disappear, or become something new. And across this region, those repeated separations help preserve two different reservoirs of life, one drawing from Asia, the other from Australia and New Guinea. The twist is that the barrier did not have to be perfect to be powerful. That can feel counterintuitive, because we often imagine borders as clean things. But in biology, a leaky boundary can still shape history. A few birds may cross. A few plants may disperse. A reptile may arrive on floating debris after the worst cruise of its life. Exceptions happen. But if large mammals, many forest-dependent animals, and whole groups of less mobile creatures are blocked most of the time, for long enough, the pattern remains. The leaks become footnotes. The filter becomes the story. And once you see that, the living world stops looking like a static arrangement of species and starts looking like a record of past opportunities. Every animal on one side is part of a lineage that found a route, survived a climate, crossed a bridge, or endured isolation. Every missing animal is the trace of a route that never opened, or opened too rarely, or closed too soon. Absence becomes evidence. Distribution becomes deep time written in bodies. And this is why the boundary feels almost ghostly. It is not simply here, now. It is yesterday layered under today, and the day before that layered under yesterday, until the present becomes a thin skin over an enormous geological past. The beach, the strait, the green hills across the water, all of that is just the final frame of a very long film. The animals are showing us scenes from earlier in the movie. But even this reversal leaves one more question hanging. If this boundary is a memory of ancient geography, then it is not really a single line at all, is it? A memory can blur. A filter can shift. A region can be crossed by some creatures and not others. So what are we actually looking at? A line, a zone, a scar, or something even stranger that only becomes visible when life itself draws the map? By this point, the case has too many clues pointing in the same direction to treat the boundary as a coincidence. The animals were the first witnesses. The seafloor was the hidden crime scene. The ice ages were the test. And each one kept giving the same strange answer. The living world in this region was not arranged by present-day distance alone. It was arranged by old connections, old separations, and the long memory of a planet that kept changing the rules. Start with the land that used to exist. During colder periods, when global sea levels fell, the shallow seas west of the boundary would drain back enough to expose huge stretches of continental shelf. Islands that look separate today could become connected to one another and to mainland Asia. For many animals, this was not island hopping. It was walking across a temporary continent. Deer, monkeys, civets, and other land animals did not need to invent some heroic ocean crossing strategy. They just needed the door to open at the right time. And again, when the climate cooled, that western door opened. But east of that hidden divide, the story was different. The water did not simply peel away and reveal an easy road. Deep channels stayed deep. Strong currents moved through them. Steep seafloor separated islands that looked close from the surface but were divided by a much older kind of distance. So when the western shelf became a bridge, these eastern passages remained moats. That is one line of evidence. Then comes the ecology. The animals most tied to continuous land, forest corridors, and freshwater systems show the divide strongly. That makes sense. A large mammal cannot usually solve a deep ocean channel by being optimistic. A forest animal that depends on a certain habitat cannot cross miles of salt water just because the island on the other side looks inviting. But birds, bats, some reptiles, and certain plants are more complicated. They can cross occasionally, blown by storms, carried by currents, or dispersed in ways that make biogeography feel like nature's most chaotic travel agency. And that is exactly what we see, not a perfect stop sign, but a selective filter. Some lineages blur the boundary. Others respect it so consistently that their absence becomes one of the strongest clues. Which means the pattern is messy in exactly the way a real natural system should be messy. Too clean, and it would look suspiciously artificial. Too random, and it would not be a pattern at all. But this is either. This is structure with exceptions. A rule with leaks. A boundary that behaves differently depending on the body trying to cross it. Then the geological evidence pulls the camera back even farther. The region between Asia and Australia is not just a pile of tropical islands sprinkled prettily into the ocean. It is one of the most geologically complicated places on Earth, shaped by moving plates, volcanic arcs, fragments of crust, deep basins, and collisions that have been rearranging land and sea for millions of years. On one side, shallow shelf seas connect the islands to Asia's past. On the other, different shelves and island arcs connect life more closely to Australia and New Guinea. Between them lies a zone where the planet itself has been folded, broken, drowned, lifted, and rearranged. So the boundary is not sitting on the map like a line someone drew after lunch. It is emerging from the machinery underneath the map. And then, modern evidence adds another layer. Scientists can compare not just where animals live, but how their relatives are related across islands. Genes, fossils, distributions, and geological reconstructions all help test the same question: did these communities come from the same source, or did they have separate histories? And again, the answer keeps pointing toward deep separation mixed with rare crossings. Many Western lineages trace back toward Asia. Many Eastern lineages trace toward Australia and New Guinea. Some have crossed the divide, yes, because life loves loopholes. But the larger pattern remains: two great biological histories meeting in a fractured island world, either fully swallowing the other. And that is when the scale of the story changes. This is no longer just about why one island has certain birds and another does not. It is about how Earth edits evolution. The planet does not merely provide a stage where life performs. It moves the walls. It floods the exits. It lowers the sea and opens corridors. It raises the sea and strands populations. It builds deep channels that survive ice ages and shallow shelves that appear and disappear like trapdoors. And life responds not once, but over and over, until those responses become patterns so strong that a naturalist with notebooks and specimens could detect them long before anyone fully understood the machinery behind them. The case is almost solved now, but not in the neat way a textbook might want. The answer is not one thing. It is not just ocean. Not just distance. Not just climate. Not just plate tectonics. It is all of them working through time, turning geography into a filter and a filter into separate evolutionary histories. So the line people talk about is really more like the visible edge of a much larger process. A scar, yes, but also a meeting place. A border, but also a mixing zone. A reminder that two worlds can sit close enough to see each other across the water and still be separated by millions of years of closed doors. And if that is true here, then the map of life is not just a map of where organisms live. It is a map of where Earth once allowed them to go. So return one last time to the shore. Bali behind you, Lombok ahead of you, the strait between them flashing in the sun like nothing more mysterious than water being water. A boat crosses it. Clouds move over it. The horizon stays quiet. And yet, after following the clues, that quiet view is almost the strangest part. Because now the empty space between those islands is not empty anymore. It is crowded with vanished coastlines, drowned plains, ice ages, deep channels, tectonic collisions, failed migrations, lucky crossings, and millions of years of life trying, and often failing, to move from one world into another. The answer to the big question is not that there is a magical wall hidden in the sea. There is no force field out there deciding which bird gets a passport. The answer is stranger, and much more powerful. A line can divide life without being visible because the real boundary is not only in the present. It is built from the past. It is made of seafloor depth, shifting sea levels, ancient land bridges, moving plates, and time long enough for separation to become identity. The water you see today is just the latest version of a much older barrier. And the animals on either side are not merely living in different places. They are carrying different histories in their bodies. That is the reveal hidden inside this whole case. Geography is not just scenery. It is not just the background painting behind evolution. Geography is one of the forces that writes the plot. It opens paths. It closes them. It breaks populations apart, and sometimes reconnects them too late for them to be the same. It turns a shallow sea into a road when the climate cools, and then drowns that road when the climate warms. It leaves a deep channel open even when much of the world's coastline has shifted. And then life does what life always does, it responds with whatever tools it has. Wings, fur, seeds, scales, rafts, luck, failure, time. That is why the pattern here is not perfectly clean, and why that messiness makes it feel more real. Some creatures crossed. Others never did. Some lineages slipped through the filter and complicated the map. Others stopped so consistently that their absence became evidence. The boundary was never a simple line where life ended. It was a long-running experiment in access. Who could move? Who could not? Who arrived when the door was briefly open? Who was stranded when the ocean came back? And who evolved in isolation long enough that, by the time humans started naming islands and drawing maps, the two sides already felt like different worlds. In that sense, this place is not an exception to how evolution works. It is a close-up of how evolution works all the time. We are used to thinking of species as if they belong neatly to environments: rainforest animals, desert animals, island animals, ocean animals. But those labels are only snapshots. Behind every living thing is a route it took, or failed to take. A mountain range it could not cross. A river that shifted. A climate window that opened. A coastline that appeared at the right moment, or disappeared too soon. Even the animals in an ordinary backyard are not just there. They are the survivors of old geography, old climates, old barriers, and old accidents that happened so far back they no longer look like events. They look like nature. And that is the mind-bending part. The world around us can feel stable because we are seeing it in a human lifetime. Forest here. Ocean there. Island there. Species in their places. But deep time turns that still picture into a moving film. Seas rise and fall. Continents drift. Volcanoes build islands. Ice sheets pull water out of the ocean and give it back. Corridors open like doors in a dark hallway, then slam shut for thousands or millions of years. And life is always moving through that changing architecture, leaving behind patterns that scientists can learn to read. Not just in fossils, though fossils are some of the best clues we have. Not just in rocks, though rocks remember things animals cannot. But in the living world itself, in where creatures are found, where they are missing, and where two histories press so close together that they almost touch. So the invisible boundary between these islands is not just a curiosity of Southeast Asia. It is a reminder that the present is full of ghosts. Not supernatural ghosts, but geological ones. Drowned landscapes. Lost bridges. Ancient separations. The kind of ghosts that do not haunt houses, but shape ecosystems. And once you see that, the map of life becomes harder to look at in the old way. A coastline is not just a coastline. A strait is not just a strait. An island is not just isolated because water surrounds it now. The real question is what surrounded it before, what connected it before, and how long life had to live with the answer. Which means that somewhere, maybe in a forest, maybe under a city, maybe beneath a calm stretch of ocean that looks completely ordinary, there are other boundaries like this one. Not always famous. Not always named. But still written into the bodies and absences of living things. And that is the final image, two islands facing each other across bright tropical water, close enough to see, close enough to imagine crossing, and yet separated by a wall made not of stone, but of time.